So I'm Moriah Thomason. I'm a fetal neuroimager, and I haven't had a chance to meet everybody. So I just wanted to give that by way of background. Also, what I bring to the conversation has really to do with studying the fetal brain. So a lot of my work is focused on building blocks. And I have this idea that understanding sort of the beginning of brain, the beginning story of the brain gives us some insight, because as an architect building something, building a complex system, I feel like there's something to be gained from understanding how you start. It's hard to start a complex system. And so I'm just going to share two ideas that I have when I talk about our findings from our lab often, because there are a couple of themes that come up when people think about fetuses thinking. So what do you think about fetuses thinking? Well, first of all, anytime you look at neuroscientific data, there tends to be a need to kind of anthropomorphize the brain. So we give the brain humanity when we talk about how it works, as like all of us across our fields. We really tend to use words that are really operationalized because of our own perceptions of ourselves. And I often in my work have to remind people, no, the brain isn't that. That's you thinking about what the brain is doing. And so this is really heavy duty in a fetus. So the second point is that the job of a brain when it's being built is a very different job. So in early papers that I would put out, I'd get reviews back and they would very quickly tell me that my, as an example, prefrontal parietal network, a network that's important for attention later in life. Why would a fetus have that? That's what they would say. They would say like, well, why? That doesn't make sense. Like they're only expecting the fetal brain to have those early systems, right? The sensory motor systems. But in fact, why wouldn't the fetal brain have that, right? Why? And so I really had to do some sort of gentle sort of explaining that I'm not conceptualizing these areas that function together as having the function that they'll later have, because that's not the job that they have to do. And
To get there.
right, they really just have to get built, right? And it's far more important to them to get built than to do attention tasks, right? So anyway, those are just like two things that I think of a lot when I try to share my work with people, because a lot of people that are seeing work of labs like my own are really going to take these concepts and they're going to place them from their own reference, right, on top of the fetal brain. And so I really do like to remind people that there's no gold standard. And it's actually one of the biggest challenges for my field is when I publish a paper, I can't say, oh, that's a picture of what good looks like, or that's a picture of bad. And in fact, it's been very hard to do that because a lot of times my questions do have to do with risk. And so how can I say this is bad that this fetus has been exposed to cannabis, for example? Because I've worked with very challenged populations that are highly stressed, low resourced, that smoke cannabis and maybe have been exposed to trauma throughout their lives. And I don't want to publish a paper saying, well, that's a bad picture in that fetal brain, because I have no basis for saying that. So I've tried to do some clever things like follow the children longitudinally, study their development, do that hippocampal connectivity map, make a map of what is a good representation and what is a bad representation, meaning what predicts better outcomes in the future, and then reclassify all the voxels as to whether they fall within the good map or the bad. It's terrible that I'm even saying that. And maybe get some traction. But really what we should be saying is we have none. We have no way. But I do love experiments. I do love opportunities to actually test. And I think one of the fun conversation things we could consider would be, what are some of the experiments that we could do as a field to begin to get more traction on some of the topics that have been discussed? I think they're really interesting.
So this has been bothering me all weekend. When we talk about consciousness, I feel like many of us assume that it's, consciousness like I have it, the usual five senses, the sense of self, something that I would understand if I could beam into the baby's experience. Do you think it's worth making a distinction between, perhaps consciousness as we experience it versus more exotic forms of consciousness? Like, might there be something it is like to be an infant that is just very, very alien to what we experience as adults? Is that a meaningful distinction?
That's been suggested by a number of people.
Sure. I mean, like AI consciousness, like if AI systems are conscious, presumably it's very, very different to how humans are conscious. Then there's, of course, there's psychedelic induced consciousness and meditative consciousness within humans is already, very different in kind from ordinary consciousness. So I think the conservative view here is that we're just occupying some tiny portion of the space of possible consciousnesses, and we want to try and explore as wide a space as we can, but we're limited by what systems we have and what evidence is available.
So I want to ask the question between development and consciousness. So with infant consciousness, there seems to be a developmental story. The brain is developed, connection is developed in humans. So is a developmental theory of consciousness something that's fundamental when you want to have a theory of consciousness? Like you can imagine the developmental theory of animal consciousness, you can imagine the developmental theory of machine consciousness. So when we have those kind of consciousness theory, do we need to tell a developmental story of like how it comes to be? Is that like ontological, fundamental, like, whatever you call it, for the developmental scientists and the consciousness scientists?
I'm happy to say that when it comes to humans, that's part of my concept. Almost everything all of the concepts that we experience have a developmental framework, but also I'm a developmentalist. So like, I don't know how to see the world in a different way, but even things like stress or uncertainty is a computation. It's something that means something different. And again, at certain times of life, you have different demands, different things you need to do. Like I want to say like responsibilities in terms of what you need to accomplish to be successful at that phase of life. And so I would argue, yes.
This is a conference on neonatal consciousness. So there was no question that development had to be at the center of it. But whether development is, you think development is a central desideratum in understanding consciousness or the mind, it's a theoretical commitment. I mean, I happen to think that if you can't at least imagine a story by which you could get from a fertilized egg to the adult mind, then you don't understand the adult mind. But you don't have to agree with that. It's also just an interesting question on its own. And with respect to alien consciousness, you can't study it if you can't imagine it, so that's hard. But secondly, many people thinking about the development of minds assume that the baby is an entirely alien creature. They have only sensory motor primitives, for example, or they have only, it's a blooming, buzzing confusion, right? So they're imagining an alien mind, but is that right? And the answer is no, neither of those are right? So, but what you want is a positive characterization of what it is like.
Maybe I can say something. Yeah, so I wouldn't have thought that developmental thing is necessary. So it's certainly in the case of humans, that's the trajectory. But if you just think of Dave talked about AI consciousness, right? You can imagine that you build a system and immediately has consciousness and there's no developmental stage.
A lot of training.
Well, but you can imagine where you build a system where you don't need the training or alien consciousness where, you just kind of build it, right? So I think as a matter of fact, right, sort of practically, whatever, but metaphysically speaking, I can imagine, maybe they're these aliens and they just pop out and then they're already conscious and you don't need to go through any developmental stages. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah. I mean, whether it turns out there is some essential developmental pathway for consciousness. You've got to go through that developmental pathway. And if you don't, you won't be conscious. I mean, there's one obvious counter argument to that, which is the one you just came up with, swamp consciousness, right. the system which somehow emerges in a swamp randomly without any of that developmental background. But would that be conscious? Yeah. If that's conscious, it looks like it's a counterexample to the strong claim that
but wait a minute,
developmental trajectory
you
was
can
required.
Imagine it but you haven't found it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah. So, but then the next question is, we have a developmental theory of existing beings, like say humans, and it turns out every human has to go through a certain developmental pathway. So I think what we can have is obviously species specific developmental theories of consciousness. But whether we're going to have a universal one, that seems somewhat unlikely to me. Maybe there's just many different developmental pathways in principle that could get you there, and a particular set that humans use.
So I've got a comment and a question. The comment, sort of observation on what you were talking about, David, about the sort of gold card, etc. As a pediatrician, actually, this is what we do. With an older child, we ask the child phenomenology, what's wrong with you? And they'll answer back. For the young infant, we can just rely on their behaviors. And as a neonatologist, once you start looking at preterm babies, their behavioral repertoire is pretty limited. We rely on imaging markers, other markers, etc. So we do that kind of already. It's kind of interesting that actually in the consciousness world, that's what your sort of method you proposed. And yeah, ultimately, the child telling us what's wrong with them, the fetus will never do that. The preterm neonate won't do that. The question, though, is more related to the ethics. So that, again, as a clinician, you know, the elephant in the room here is you know, should we be resuscitating babies at 22 weeks? Should we? The whole abortion debate hinges on some of the sort of things which are discussed here, and I think it's really good and important as a scientist that you kind of are blind to that. You look at what the science, your experiment shows, objectively it shows. If it shows that a 12-week fetus is conscious, whichever experiment you're doing, so be it. If you, but at the same time, I think it is worth emphasizing why these are important, bringing the ethics in, bringing the philosophy in. I mean, it's been amazing for me as a clinician to be surrounded by people of such different disciplines to sort of see those points of view. And sometimes you either go one extreme, and I think it was mentioned yesterday in the talk with you know, fetal pain at 20 weeks, and they feel excruciating pain. I don't know how you can say that, but obviously that's being politicized by a credible individual. And I think we need to be nuanced, and we also need to decide what is our balance of probability. As a scientist, we want the 95th% confidence interval, but assigning consciousness to a very tiny baby, is it on the balance of probability, or is it, you know, precautionary principle? And I think we, you know, having those sort of frameworks is still important.
Yeah. So there's like the Charles Court case in the UK, and then there's in the US there are a bunch of cases, but there's like the Tinsley Lewis case in Texas, where these doctors basically didn't want to continue to treat and wanted to kick the baby out of the hospital. The mother sued. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court sided with the mother. And you know, so the doctors at the time, like all these experts, they thought there was you know, you would have to be very aggressive in treating this child, and there's just no, you know, no prospect of a good life, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't want to do it, but the mother disagreed, right? And so we actually talked about this case, and the interesting was this Tinsley Lewis had a heart condition, and what they were treating was like the you know, like they just thought that it would need to go through another surgery and like all these different surgeries, and like why put the child through, just, you know, let the child die. You know, that was the doctor's perspective. And now so what we argued in the paper was that actually the heart condition doesn't preclude you from being able to live a life, like, you know, in terms of fundamental conditions, you know, like you can actually, you know, be able to still have interpersonal relationships, you know, and things like that. And so 5 years later, Tinsley Lewis is still alive, and she's kind of interacting with her mother, you know, like, so they send her home, and then, you know, the mother decided to raise her, and she's, you know, like we actually reached out to her mother, to a legal representative, and she's disabled, but she's like, it seems like she can sing, she can kind of watch TV with her, you know, mother and things like that. And so in that case, we argued that this kind of showed that we shouldn't just rely on quality of life assessments, but you know, you can look at what the child can actually do. And so so in that case, we argued that the doctors actually got it wrong, right? Because they were just focused on, this is just going to be too much pain for the child, and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah.
Thanks. I guess I want to ask you, Dave, to say a bit more about your hierarchy of markers. And I guess the question is, in what sense is it a hierarchy, in the way you're thinking of it? So you started off with the vegetative state kind of cases, where you don't have behavior. That motivates us to move down to the neural markers and then maybe down to the computational markers. So it sounded like you were thinking there that we go with the behavior where we've got it. If we don't have it, we go down to the neural markers. If we don't have those, we go to the computational. But I mean, one problem is we've got, as you said, we've got too much behavior with the AI. It's not a lack of behavior that we've got. It's that we just doesn't feel right to put much weight, maybe any weight on the behavior. So I guess that's one question about, is it a hierarchy of defeaters or what? And I guess the real issue, which I think hasn't quite been grasped here, but it seems to me really the fundamental one is, if we start where many of us want to start, not everyone, that's clear, but I think where you're inclined to start, and I'm inclined to start, which is doing science where you privilege the phenomenology in the sense that you privilege people who are able to introspectively report that, and then you try and bootstrap your way from that. It seems to me entirely possible, if you can do that, and you privilege your way to markers that you can use across the variety of domains. If you can do that, and I don't know if you can, you may well come up with markers that are computational, and they give you the better generalizations, they give you more explanatory purchase, they explain the other markers, and they look like they're more tightly tied to the phenomenology, they capture structural isomorphisms and the like. And the behavior, you get a one-many relation with the behaviors, and that enables you to say, as people were wanting to say quite often, well, you can't trust the behavior. How do you know you're being, it could just be an illusion, could be non-conscious, you could be gamified. So I guess that's a long-winded way of just asking you to flesh out in a bit more detail the Chalmers hierarchy of markers or something. And you weren't being recorded, so now for the film, for the tape.
It's not like this is a well thought out hierarchy. It's like, what am I going to talk about in the panel discussion? Hey, well, partly inspired by hearing your presentation and Claudia's and Nicolo's and a number of the others. It's like, there seems to be this interesting structure, at least in practice, among these different sources of evidence. I certainly don't want to make it wouldn't want to make it an absolute hierarchy, or even say it's exactly a structure of defeaters. I mean, a lot of it just is going to be a function of what kind of evidence of a given kind, how much evidence of a given kind we have, and whether it's useful or relevant. As you say, in the AI case, we have a whole lot of behavioral evidence, but it's not terribly useful as evidence because it can be defeated in various ways, mainly because of the way it's produced. So stop back. So maybe at some point, maybe I can develop a more serious epistemological story here. But I am inclined to think that I'm inclined to accept the point about the primacy of phenomenology and/or verbal report. That's our basic evidence about consciousness. If I hadn't experienced consciousness myself, or perhaps hadn't interacted with other people talking about being conscious, I think I just wouldn't really have any serious, strong evidence for believing and postulating phenomenal consciousness.
Susan wants to jump in.
Yeah, I thought you discussed these issues very, very beautifully this morning. But as a
Here's the
scientist,
but.
I think the idea that you can say in advance what any ordering of evidence is just ridiculous, right? You have to. And I don't think there are any neural markers, actually. But the things that we're taking as neural markers are validated, even in the vegetative state work that I know nothing about, but I've heard a little bit about in this conference, is that things like the global local test. Okay, so they noticed that there was variance in the global local test, but then they validated it against something else, being able to follow a command or whatever. I mean, so you're always going back and forth. And the idea that you can do this without theory is also ridiculous, right? And so, I mean, theory isn't something like a marker, right?
It's it's an iterative process where you go back and
Yeah,
forth,
and
but
it's just
So I think I
necessarily
agree
that.
with Susan that, yeah, neural and computational markers have to be ultimately validated by reference to behavioral phenomenological
Yeah,
evidence.
as far as you can get evidence about them. And this is so hard. And what's so moving is the progress that's being made on these fronts. But it's so early days compared to other areas of neuroscience and psychology.
so can I have if there's that real deep fundamental priority to the verbal report and the behavioral markers, and that's the, as it were, the yardstick by means of which we validate these computational ones.
Because it's a consciousness, right? I mean,
Right. Okay. So, but that's the story. I get it. And now we've got the AI system that's got those, as it were, verbal reports and behavioral markers. Isn't it a little bit odd to think that it's got the markers that are doing all the gold standard work in us? I share the intuition that that's not enough, but you see from, as it were, an epistemological point of view, that seems a little bit weird. It's got the thing.
today why that won't work, right? Is it because there also has to be the relevant similarity? The theory tells you what the relationship is between those markers and what you're looking for, and that those conditions aren't met in an AI system. So there's no operational marker there just can't be an operational marker.
Well, Rob Long has given a nice analysis of the AI case, and we don't not just looking for verbal reports about mental states. We're looking for verbal reports of mental states caused by those mental states. There's some internal state that actually triggers the report, and he thinks in the case of AI, there's not a lot of evidence to believe that the verbal reports AI systems.
But what's the assumption that you've got that in your own case? And it's also the behavior. I also said behavior in the AI. You don't know that that's true in your own case.
It's a big theory that we picked up from other people. That's a view.
Sid? Yeah, actually, this was almost the same question related to the gold standard. And I wanted to say two things, actually. The first one is that if we want to study that from a scientific perspective, we had to start somewhere. And the goals, if you told me that the gold standard is going to be phenomenology, 10, 15 years ago, we would never have started this research program, because this is something that you learn from the beginning. Is we are taught that phenomenology is what's left after you explain everything from a cognitive perspective. So if you tell me, so that's why I was a little bit, I want to say that really, from our perspective, it's exactly the opposite hierarchy. We start with the computational markers, then we go to the neural markers, then we go to the behavior, which is much less interesting because of the zombie arguments and so on. And we take philosophers very seriously. And basically phenomenology is what you don't want to talk about, because this is basically something that's, yeah.
You don't want to talk about for what purpose. If you're interested in phenomenal experience, that's what you have to talk about.
Sure, but in terms of like measures, objective measures, that's something you don't want to talk about, because you learn very clearly that actually I cannot even demonstrate that you have phenomenology yourself. You see, except like privacy argument and so on. So when it comes to basically this hierarchy of and maybe fortunately it was not recorded earlier, but I'd like to really like challenge the fact that actually not challenge, but just say that we had to start somewhere. We know it's not perfect. It's actually, and even myself, I have like a lot of I'm not very convinced about the current neural markers per se, but at least they give us some information. I think they're taking us in the right direction, but still this is the best we can do, I believe, so far.
Yeah. I mean, all my claims were about phenomenal consciousness. And there's no question, studying phenomenal consciousness is hard. There's a lot of stuff which is easier. So studying access consciousness and so on is clearly much more straightforward. So in some sense, sure, start with all those other things, but we're here among friends, and what we're interested in is phenomenal consciousness. And then, given that we're studying that hard topic, how do we get evidence of it? And phenomenology is great, but I've only got that for one person. Therefore, we go to verbal report is number two, and we want to make contact with things like computational models of access consciousness and so on. But when you say phenomenology comes last, I take it the question is almost, don't even worry about that as a subject matter until you've done the rest of your science. And
Yeah, attention, access, and so on.
At some point, you have to
And-
start working on phenomenal consciousness.
Sure, but
That's what you're interested in.
that's what we're interested in, and that's where we're going. But right now, we don't have. I mean, we don't have a good marker of it, and that's it. And it's going to take a little while, I believe.
So I want to follow up on that. And I think one of the problems with studying phenomenology is we ask people and they tell us. And we know as cognitive psychologists that people don't have insight into their own thinking. They make up stories. They can be wrong. You can hypnotize somebody and give them post-hypnotic suggestions and they'll confabulate. So, and it's not just AI that can. So I worry about the reliance on language and see studying infants as a way to get around it. I mean, what about a musician? Language can't get into the conscious experience of music or the conscious experience of painting or any of those activities that clearly take consciousness. But the language of phenomenology is brutal and can be wrong. So, right, I mean, stop there.
Yeah, I think it's on the same line in a way, but I just thinking as a cognitive and perceptual psychologist and neuroscientist, I was surprised by that hierarchy because I don't want to go to the neural substrates only when I don't have behavior. I want to understand the relation between those levels, right? And if we can get to the phenomenology, that's great. But theory has to be informing, and that partly comes from the computational. So if we're thinking of the neonate, and I'm not an expert at all, so probably one has to go in a different way. But I think of adult consciousness. Clearly, I would go against that hierarchy, and I would think that what we're trying to see is what's the relation. And I may have different behaviors that even dissociate. So which one do I go with? My eye movements or what I'm aware of, right? So I think that it's a little bit much more nuanced and that you do need the theory to be generating at least some questions, right? But that the only way to advance is by having exchange of ideas among those different levels, rather than just resorting to the neural one if I think that I don't have another one.
And I think the infant case is particularly interesting and messy in this case, because it's one where all three of those markers clearly have some central role to play. Like in the, a couple of those other cases, the behavioral markers are useless. In one case, the neurobiological stuff is unavailable. In the infant case, we've got behavior, not quite as useful as in adults, but still useful. We've got neural markers to go to town on, and increasingly computational markers. And yeah, I didn't really intend to suddenly say that in any such case we should just work down the hierarchy. I think almost certainly we need all three of those methods.
Yes. Thank you all very much for an absolutely fabulous meeting. I'm Rebecca Folkerth. I'm a neuropathologist, a perinatal pediatric neuropathologist. And what I hear being said is that we really, really need multidisciplinary meetings just like this to bring together theorists and psychologists. I'm very happy that Dr. Graff and Dr. Austin in their presentations talked a little bit about the actual fetal brain, the actual cells and so on, and the sequences of development, because obviously I'm biased, but to me, that's the gold standard. And if you don't have the structure there, and same with what Moriah was talking about, there's nothing to discuss. You cannot have consciousness if you don't have the ingredients, the infrastructure, and and again, it does depend. It depends. I've said this a few times. I'm a broken record. It depends completely on how you're defining consciousness. But as as physicians, if you're unconscious, that's a well understood state. Or if you have a disorder of consciousness, and consciousness is not having those things, being awake and having awareness. That's the definition of consciousness. Obviously, without that, you cannot have any of these other things. So that's kind of the bare minimum. But I would love to see this kind of dialogue among various specialists continue, and I would hope that I could get some of my fellow neuropathologists to come and share what work has been going on, because there's a lot more since Kostovich and the other things that were presented, which are definitely beautiful pieces of work, but there's a lot going on, and correlation with imaging. There's a lot going on that I think could shed some light on this, but thank you very much for the chance to comment.
That's all right. Actually, this works. So thank you. It's been really fantastic meeting. I feel like I could just, sit for a week and listen to what everybody has to say. I've learned so much, and I think there is so much to learn from everybody, because we are getting such different perspectives on the issue of infant consciousness. But my comment, it dovetails really well with what was said there in the back, and what I just wanted to go back to what you said, Moriah, about, I think as a cognitive neuroscientist who was trained in visual perception and how features become meaningful representations in the ventral visual stream, I think putting aside artificial intelligence for a moment, I think really kind of bringing the issue of consciousness back to how the human brain realizes it is a really grounding principle for all of us, and to some extent should, particularly in the concept for infant consciousness, should inform how the hierarchy of those markers. So I do actually agree with the hierarchy that you proposed, Dave, but I think our priority as a field at this point in time is to understand how the brain is built, because without those structures that enable the capacities that we know are part and parcel of having phenomenology, such as having memory, having representations of oneself extended over time, knowing about the world, having sustained attention so that we can think about the world and contemplate various aspects of it. Without those faculties, we probably can't have phenomenology, but maybe some people will disagree. And we can have those faculties without, the building blocks that realize those faculties. So I think it's really important for us as a field to realize that, at least from the science perspective, the priority is to understand how the brain is enabled, how the brain is developing from inception onwards, and to take that really seriously. So maybe we don't have markers yet, but understanding what capacities are present in structure and function at what points in time really inform this debate, I think. So just to ground us in the physical reality of how we are able to be conscious as human beings, and that's very different from machines.
I had a little bit of a response to that, which was in the middle of your comment. There was a lovely stream of behavioral markers. Working memory, sustained attention, blah, blah, blah. And I built half a career, I guess, on picking on behavioral markers for consciousness and showing that they weren't unambiguous. And so I have a worry about Dave's hierarchy, which is just that when we look at it, we might think, oh well, the computational level, there's a high theory there, and that's really difficult stuff to deal with. Actually, I think behavioral markers are stupendous.
So just for people who don't know, this is the blind side half of your career based on where the relevant behavioral markers were performance.
Yeah,
but there was also behavioral markers going the other way, namely
going the other way, and so the blind side and the cerebral achromatopsia, where the patient can do things, but the patient is doing things in a way that don't resemble the way in which we might achieve the same goals. If you ask him for his verbal report of his experience is very, very different from mine. And yet at surface, you might think that the cerebral achromatopsic is processing wavelength in the same way as we do. Nope. You might think that the blind sight subject has, vision, but with the consciousness deleted, but no, all sorts of masking experiments in normal observers showing every which way flavor of attention doesn't correlate necessarily with consciousness. So I just think that it might be an error to assume that the behavioral level is easy, because I don't think it is.
As far as I know, you don't break the dissociation between consciousness and verbal report of consciousness.
That's true.
You rely on that.
I rely on that. That's yeah. Or at least I rely on patients saying no.
Yeah, I just have a very little point regarding the interaction between Susan, Dave, and Jim. Trying to defend a little bit the marker approach. I think the marker approach can totally agree that the markers are established with some theoretical assumptions and observation. But I think the main point is you don't start in the marker approach with assumptions of theories of consciousness that you will have to find the necessary and sufficient conditions in the system that correlates with the necessary and sufficient conditions of the theories of consciousness. So you're not trying to find the global workspace. You start with the marker. Am I correct?
So when I'm talking about theory,
and
I'm not talking
among
about
the
philosophical
and among
theories
the
of
markers,
consciousness.
some markers are based on theories of consciousness assumptions, like the P300 and the global local paradigm. But you don't start with all the assumptions of the theory of consciousness. You of course, you have theoretical assumptions about consciousness, but not. You don't start with endorsing one theory when you are.
No, but the point is, when I say that all science is theory-based, I'm talking about scientific theories, not philosophical theories of consciousness. And actually, if you look at the global workspace work, it's actually been very productive about access consciousness, right? But it was based in a huge amount of theory about the relation between perceptual and cognitive representations and their neural underpinnings, right? So that's what I mean by theory-based. I don't mean that you certainly don't start with the IIT theory and develop markers, right? Because that's not a scientific theory.
The marker approach is proposing that we don't start to endorse any theory of consciousness, even the scientific ones. We start with markers. Some markers derives from the theories, like the global, local global effect. But other markers they don't derive from the theory. For instance, the multisensory marker, the multisensory marker, the Buck-Gurker effect. It doesn't come from one theory of consciousness. Comes with observation that capacity probably requires consciousness to be capable to have a multi.
Where does that argument come from? That capacity probably requires consciousness. That needs justification, and
you need theoretical justification, but not necessarily assuming one theory of consciousness.
That's not the claim. The claim is that it's got to be theoretically based in something. Right. So, and you're presupposing lots of theory, lots of developed theory in neuroscience and in representational computational theories, and there's just no alternative to that. There's no theory neutral markers.
I think that maybe there's
yeah.
You guys are treating verbal report of humans as a theory neutral marker. That's not, I mean,
relatively.
There are situations in which we don't believe what people say. I mean, Ned brought up anosognosia before. People will say black and blue. I've had this experience. And we look at the brain damage, we look at the behavior, and we say, no, we don't believe you. Right? They're confabulating. They're not lying. So it's sincere, introspective report, and we know they've got mental states, not like LLMs. So there's some story about causation of mental states. But anosognosia, I think we don't always treat, verbal in first person current. There's no memory problem. First person contemporaneous introspective report as inviolable. We've got these background assumptions.
I think there's really, I mean, there has to be a continuum from markers to theories. Actually, I quite like, the old line that a language is a dialect with an army. Maybe a theory is a mark. Okay, a language is a dialect with a navy. Okay, so a theory is a marker with a navy. It's like, you get enough markers together, then basically you get something like a theory. And the markers are the things you have which are relatively close. The way I think about it, there's things which are at the close end of the epistemological chain, and the things that are, kind of go further down, and theories are closer to the, markers are very strong on the evidence. Markers are ultimately sources of evidence. Theories, we want to be more than just sources of evidence. We want them to be, explanations of the phenomenon, and that does actually require a lot more. And once you've got a good theory, we can use it for all kinds of things, like producing all kinds of markers. But then the theory itself has to be grounded in markers, and it's going to be a very long, complex negotiation among all these sources of evidence as we see at a conference like this.
Wondered if I could make a few comments about ethical significance, following up on Matthew's interesting remarks. So I do think that it's one of the things that makes this topic so interesting, is it feels like there's something ethically at stake. And that came out in the talk where we discussed the possibility of pain in a 20-week-old, which I'm skeptical about. One point you made in your comments, Matthew, is that we need to be very careful in making inferences from the premise that something is a welfare subject with moral status to a conclusion like we must keep this thing alive at all costs. So those inferences, I take it, to be quite dicey. One point I wanted to make is that here's another dicey inference. Something is not a welfare subject, therefore we can do what we want with it. My favorite example is dead people. So it's a controversial issue, but I don't think that dead people are welfare subjects, though they used to be. But it's not true that you can do what you want with them. So for example, you can't take my head and put it on a spike when I asked for my ashes to be, scattered in a beautiful wood. It doesn't follow, I think, that you would be wronging the dead person. You might have been wronging the person when they were alive. So conversely, if we could show that the 20-week-old fetus was not conscious, and so not yet a welfare subject, I think that would be extremely interesting and important. But it wouldn't necessarily mean that we don't have important moral obligations in terms of how we treat that thing. But so that's just to say, I think these, as you rightly pointed out, any of these inferences from the claim that something is or is not a welfare subject to further moral conclusions are going to be highly fraught. Having said all of that, I do think, and not everyone's going to agree with this, I do think that the question of whether a being can feel pain is of the utmost ethical significance, and is one of the most interesting questions in this area.
Yeah, so thanks for that. I totally agree with you, and actually that corresponds well with my view. And you can think of like, there are disputes about whether plants are welfare subjects, right? But you might think it's wrong to just chop down a tree, right? So, and I agree with you. Like, I think your example of the dead is a really good one as well. And there are disputes about, like, so if we think, I think Claudia did the survey, if you thought that consciousness didn't really come online until 22nd week, right? So before then, some people think that, that could be a subject of moral status without having consciousness or et cetera, et cetera. But there you might think, and as I mentioned, like you got the Thomason line, right? It depends on the location of the fetus. And so even if that were true, there's still the right of the woman and things like that. So that's like a further consideration. And then just on the pain thing, like a lot of people, and this was I think this is a problem for Peter as well. This is what I was kind of getting at, was like, if you just take pain, which is different from consciousness, I think, but if you take like sentience and pain as sort of like, something that's very significant, then there are all these bugs, like all these cockroaches in New York, and like whatever, it would be wrong to, like kill them for one thing. And then if you buy into Singer's easy rescue argument, right? Then it's actually very easy to keep them alive. You should leave your food like all over the place to keep them alive, right? Because it's easy rescue, right? And so it seems like you might have a positive obligation to leave your leftover food like everywhere. So oh, okay. It's very altruistic of you, very charitable.
My mother, who was in a concentration camp during World War II, actually did think it was her obligation to eat the leftover food, and she saved it and ate the next day or the next day.
Oh, yeah. But did she think that was, she had an obligation to leave it for the cockroaches? And
No.
Yeah.
Oh, eat it. I leave it. You said not eat it.
No, leave it for the, yeah.
First of all, thank you for organizing the meeting and for this fascinating discussion. Partly sparked by the distinction between, behavioral neural and computational markers, and Tim's point about sort of the not perfect reliability of verbal reports. I wanted to raise an interesting special case where I think these lines blur, which is, some of the classic work on vegetative state patients with neural markers require a scientist to interpret the brain imaging. But there's, really amazing advances happening in brain-computer interfaces right now. For example, the work of Eddie Chang and others, where you can get verbal reports from the brain. That is, you train, decoders, sophisticated models to read neural activity with invasive implants, and you can generate speech. And so what is that? Is that a neural marker? In a way, there's a model, there's a computational model looking at brain activity. So it's a neural marker. Is it verbal behavior? Yes. I mean, it's speaking. Is it computational? Yes, because the model is required to interpret the neural activity to generate the behavior. So I don't know what that means, but it just strikes me that, that to me would have some believability to it, as long as we think that the model is working well, and we don't have reasons to believe it's not, because the person might endorse what it says. And even the classic vegetative state work, a lot of it was about saying yes or no by following one command or another. And so I wonder what status we give sort of computer generated speech from brain activity, because our speech is generated from brain activity. So you just have a computational intermediate. Is that less good or similar? What do people think?
This actually connects to the whole field of doing similar things in AI, where it's the whole regime of mechanistic interpretability, where we're trying to, take a giant neural network and train a decoder on that to figure out, what it might be processing at this point, maybe ultimately something akin to mental states, but maybe at the very least certain forms of representations. Of course, one question here is, what is the the ground truth that you're training these systems on? And they for doing it with neuroscience, you can start, I guess, with relatively normal patients for whom we know what they're thinking about as validated by verbal reports, and then we use that to figure out, okay, well, this goes along with thinking about that. I don't know exactly what people use as validation in the work you're talking about on disorders of consciousness. But I don't know that it would count as exactly as a verbal report. I mean, a verbal report has to be a verbal report of a mental state had because you're accessing that mental state. It feels more like it could be akin to like a reflex response, which isn't necessarily a.
Well, the most recent stuff is actual generated speech
in
response to that.
Okay.
The original stuff is yes or no, right? But the latest stuff published within the last couple of years is actually having a conversation through your brain.
The brain is not going through particular speech modes there, but it's like you're decoding some speech signals from the brain, and it's an open question what's actually being experienced in this case. Okay, people want to say this is actually the subject is conscious and understanding the conversation.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And would the subject agree?
I think so.
This is clarify. This is not a medical subject or a normal subject.
Oh, I see.
Has a spinal cord injury. Right. Cannot speak anymore. So you record from the temporal cortex, external speech that you compare to a brain-computer interface, and then you can do that in real time and interact with the person. And the person is here. So they like even doing some gestures, but cannot speak except with the computer.
And it's validated on other patients or on reports by this patient?
There were two papers in Nature last year, one in with ECOG and one with intracranial recording. All of it is with infants, of course. But yes, and it's going to come very soon because it is to non-invasive technology. So there will be always the case of asking actually whether there's really a phenomenology there or not. But in principle, you would assume that it's done with intent.
Well, this person is entirely intact and just can't speak, so presumably he can hear, and so he can tell you whether he means it.
Can he blink? Can he blink? You have eyelid?
Yeah, they can blink.
Okay, so you use that for validation.
It's novel, but it's like without with ChatGPT.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Yeah.
you also have, there are
Not like.
patients who can speak their voice and patients, so we have the same kind of invasive implants that you can validate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's really, really fascinating. Thank you for organizing this. So I have the feeling that we have like three, like a triangle. So we have the brain, which is the neural thing, and then we have the behavior, and then the phenomenology. And there's like a big hole in the middle, which is something is missing. So how you put this two together? And for me, the big hole is the body, is the physiology of the body that actually connects the behavior to the brain, and that gives the phenomenology. And actually going back to discussion about the patient, presumably this patient already had experience of going through certain events in life through the body, and that was encoded somewhere in the brain. It's not popping up from nowhere. So it's coming through, going through the experience. And because we're talking about developing the things, and I'm sorry for coming from a very different perspective, I still have the feeling that this meeting is very much neurocentric and stays in the head. And I want to get it out from the head. Actually, the first neurons to develop, they're not developing in the brain, they're developing in the belly, in the guts. Yeah. And there is a robust body of work that show that actually our conscious perception depends, or the neural activity is highly dependent on the cardiac activity that is like connected with the brain. So there is like a very active brain-body interaction. It's like you don't see the same stimuli, whether you present in systole versus diastole, for instance. Yeah. So it's kind of like a massive change there. So what do you feel about this like big hole in the field on the presentation that we had? So that's about where is the body?
There was a lovely poster in the poster session about the development of interoception in the infant. That's a good place to start.
Another approach would be to expand that node of the triangle that has the brain and expand that to include the body. So the physical basis of consciousness may or may not be just the brain. So yeah, so that would be, I don't know if that would satisfy the urge to fill in the hole in the middle, but somehow that would be another way to work the body in.
Yeah, hi. I just want to extend on and echo some of the things that Suzanne was saying and Marissa Carrasco is also saying. I really think this neural markers thing makes no sense. We have no idea where in the brain this is happening. Russ Pauldrack shows that we can't even do a reverse inference from the literature for Broca's area. Like you can, but it's just barely mathematically reasonable to do it. To now go and get a neural marker of phenomenal consciousness or something like that and say, this is a marker of where it exists in infants, I just don't see it. So I'm actually in this camp of finding these behavioral markers. But I think there we run into a different issue, which you guys are also hinting at, which is that this is also theory-based, right? Not theory-based, like Suzanne's saying, in the consciousness theories, but theory-based in the sense that you have to conceive of what constitutes a good marker. Right. So if I'm doing research in episodic memory, I have a sense for how to build a task for what I think the computations and representations that go into that construct are. And if I don't have the same operational definition for consciousness, I don't see a good chance as an experimentalist to build a task in infants that could allow me to do that. And I think maybe something that could help is both a process model of what's going on with conscious perception. And as you guys sort of mentioned, are going to meet about, what is the function of this thing? If I don't have answers to these questions, my ability to come up with an experimental design is going to be very, very difficult.
What is the most theory neutral behavioral marker we have apart from verbal report? Is there a relatively?
It's a theory neutral behavioral marker. It is tied up in our concept of what we're measuring. So you're stuck in a conceptual sandwich where you have concept, behavior, concept again when you're interpreting. There's no such thing.
Yeah. It all goes back to, Pine and Durham. There's no theory neutral observation.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think my question follows a little bit after Anna's question. So I've heard about many different types of consciousness: interoceptive consciousness, affective consciousness, sensory motor consciousness, perceptual consciousness, cognitive consciousness. But maybe I missed a lot. I'm sure I missed a lot. But I haven't really been told about the way they connect, or perhaps whether there's a developmental order between them. And for instance, I was very, very struck by what Moriah said when she sort of was, outraged that people would say, oh, only this part of the brain has to develop first. No, they all develop at the same time. So does that mean that in fact, all the aspects of consciousness develop at the same time? Or is there a developmental order that we can track? And if so, is there also a kind of hierarchical degree of complexity? And also, is it conceivable that you can have, if there is a developmental order, which I tend as a sort of lay person in those questions, but I tend to think there has to be a developmental order because of a kind of vital necessity order. Then can you imagine that something is conscious without going through those stages? And then does not that if you do have to go through those stages, does that not tell something about how sort of we might be missing something by focusing, for instance, as it seems to be the case, on the cognitive aspects, rather than considering all that, sort of vast array of types of consciousness which are interdependent. So, it's a long question, but I mean, there were different types of consciousness I heard about without ever really, I thought, hearing something about their developmental story and their respective connection. So could you say more about that?
I'm going to be mindful of time. I really appreciate that point. I would actually go to I'm not an expert in terms of responding to this. It feels to me like what I'm hearing is that we do think about different levels, and it feels like those levels do have developmental stages. I would leave it to others to say, I think it's important to recognize that, and that we think about, maybe we don't want to put them into an order, but for example, the ways that we make decisions about what it is we're seeing as representing consciousness, we're going to use different markers to say at different stages that's a signal to me, because the capacity of the human, talking about human consciousness, to give us the response has to do with what that human's able to show us. And again, I think it does go to this argument that you made also, which is what does it need to have to get the job done at that time?
So I think your frustration is understandable, but the way I see this conference is it's mainly been about visual visual experience. And we don't know how to answer that question even for it. So the fact we haven't answered it for all those other that's just, we don't know how to even do it for that. So maybe we have to do it for all at once, but that's even more daunting, right?
Don't forget the beep, 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 boop. It's auditory.
A lot of people talk about olfactory.
Yeah.
I think that's, for my money, that's kind of, the baby needs that. There's a functional role really early on, by the mother, by the breast milk, latch on. We know it doesn't go to the family. It's got a different neural pathway. You don't need to have cortical connection for olfaction, different routes.
It's a very special system.
It's a different system.
It's a very special system.
I think that, if I did that, I think that comes on first. But the problem is that the systems that you might need come on first are the ones that are hardest to study because they're less cognitive, as it were. there's a kind of inverse relationship between ease of study and what you might think a prior to one person.
But it's the cognitive stuff that we end up, I think, mainly getting through verbal report.
Yeah.
No, verbal report is about whether I see it. I mean, it's about phenomenal. I mean, it's evidence with respect to phenomenology.
I suspect I disagree. So,
Memory.
When we see a color, we end up, I think, reporting something about the nature of an object in the outside world. We don't actually end up reporting our phenomenology. We're only our phenomenology is actually dissociates from what we would report about the color of the thing in the outside world.
Well, I think memory occurs really early, and that's cognitive. I mean, that occurs even before you're born.
Yeah.
Yeah. Habituation.
So go ahead. I think it's the one that people ask question.
Oh boy. So a few comments, and I hope they make sense. I'm something of a academic bastard / orphan, and I kind of go into these debates. Sometimes it feels like I'm in the middle of a divorce. I don't quite know how to feel about it. Like, for instance, like in terms of theories, like, you know, it seems like sometimes like you want to be faithful to what their claims are, but oftentimes it seems like they're using language differently and not even talking about the same explanandum. And some of the differences might be overstated in terms of you could potentially like each one is seeing different sides of an elephant. But I guess it's the question is, so earlier someone could comment on defeaters. I don't know if I quite follow that in terms of their significance. And then a suggestion, right, and a comment. So you mentioned neural markers, and I think you're right, but I also wonder whether like the hyperscanning work actually might be very suggestive in terms of like some areas that show like when people are engaging in similar sense making, showing like high alignment across individuals. And so like there's a lot of inferential leaps to be made, but I don't know if it's quite as hopeless as you're saying. But okay, suggestion / question. When you're talking about this triangle, I'm wondering if this corresponds to something. It's an approach I use. I call it Moriah phenomenology. So it's basically like it's okay. So it's just the same thing as a triangle. So it's basically taking like the Moriah levels and then use them like you're filling in a crossword puzzle, and then considering to be like these supervenient levels. Is that similar to the triangle idea, where each one's constraining the others?
What is the triangle? Was that Anna's triangle?
So for instance, like so you have like a computational functional description, a mechanistic implementation description, and an algorithmic description. And then you kind of go across them, and where you can't make purchase on one, you might be able to inform the others. And this helps you to potentially move between different kinds of systems where you're potentially ignorant of how they're functioning. So for instance, like the latent space of a transformer, or like decoding from like the brain. And it may be like, if you have like an algorithmic account, you can move between them. Probably didn't make sense, but we should talk later.
We've got Mars 3 levels. We've got Anna's triangle. We've got my 3-level hierarchy. We have a lot of threes here, but
Okay. I think that's the end. I want to